Today is all about fixing your doublings. Stay tuned. Hello, I'm Matt Willis Bagpiper, and on this channel I make videos to make you a stronger and more confident piper. If you like this kind of content, please consider subscribing to the channel, liking the video, commenting below with any thoughts you might have, and sharing this with any pipers you might have in your life. So, let's get on with it. So before we start, the sheet we have here is free, and there's a link right below where you can download your own copy. It is 2 pages. It's not completely exhaustive of everything you can do, but it gives you a good start, and you could easily build a lot more doubling exercises using the same format we have here. So one of the things that I think is problematic in a lot of pipers' doublings, it's the initial G grace note that takes you from wherever you're going to the doubling itself. And let's think about what the doubling's really for. We use doublings to emphasize a note. We want it to have more attack, more punch, more power than a note without a doubling. The primary way we get this is actually the G grace note, that landing of the G grace note crisply and smartly right on the beat and right on the note. The thing that makes it a doubling, the separation of that note, that further emphasizes the note. It's less important in many ways than the initial G grace note that takes us there. So this exercise here is really about dialing that G grace note down to the proper size so you get a nice crisp chop as you make your changes into these doublings. If we take a look at the exercise sheet, you can see I have them labeled. And again, it's not every possible combination. I picked some of the more common or tricky ones for folks to work on. We're going to start here with the low A to C doubling. Happens in Scott and the Brave, happens in High Road to Gerlach, happens in a ton of tunes. If you take a look at it, the first bar is just an A, a G grace note to A G grace note to A, and then finally a G grace note to C. And the idea here is that as you're playing this, I want you to really dial those G grace notes down. I don't want it to be tight because you're pinching your finger, but I don't want to see a big flappy G grace note. It should be nice and controlled. I'm going to go ahead and put this metronome at, I don't know, 75. And we're going to play just the first 2 bars here. And one thing I wouldn't mind at this point, especially for the more beginning player, is actually looking down at your fingers while you do it. I know that's counterintuitive, and most everyone's to say never look at your fingers. But if you're looking at your fingers and you see that happening in a really big grace note rather than something controlled, you know to bring it back down. And what you're looking for is that grace note taking you from the A to the C should be the same size as the grace notes that are happening when you're just staying on the A. And not we don't want to like use that G grace note as some moment where it floats in the air and it allows all of our fingers to kind of catch up, if you will, and close down on the note at that point. We want to make that G grace note just as crisp as the G grace notes we use just to separate notes. All right, the next 2 bars over here, we're actually going to be breaking down the doubling into its core components. In this case, being a C doubling, we have a G grace note and a D grace note. We're just going to be putting those on the beat. And again, with that D grace note, we're looking to make it the same size as the G grace note. We don't want it too long. We want it nice and controlled. We don't want it overly tight, but we don't want it big, loose, and floppy either. The next section starts the same. We have a G grace note to C, D grace note to C, but then you can see we actually have the C doubling written out properly. And those 2 bars would go like this. And I want you to note that that doubling is starting right on the beat. That G grace note is taking you down with the click of the metronome over here. You don't want the doubling before the beat. It should sound like the word button, not baton. Ta-ta, button. So that D grace note's happening after the beat and not before. Not da-da, baton. That would be where the G grace note's coming early, the D grace note's landing you on the beat. And then finally, the last part of this exercise, we have the A's that we were starting on now we're switching up to the doubling. So it's very similar actually to how we started this whole thing, but now rather than just the G grace note, we're going to do the full doubling. So there you go. That's the structure of this exercise. And which ones do we have? We have low A to C doubling, what we just went through, low G to B doubling, D to E doubling, F to E doubling, because one's coming from underneath and you got that whole hand switch, one's coming from above and it can be hard to control those two fingers. And on the next page we have D to F doubling. Ooh, lots of G grace notes in that one. And a nice switch between that D and the F. And then we have E to D doubling. And again, this isn't exhaustive. There's tons of other possibilities, but they're all built the same way. All of these exercises you see are built the same way. So we're going to go ahead and I'm going now just to play through the low A to C doubling from beginning to end. Low G to B doubling. Not a lot to add to this one. It's largely the same as the A to C doubling. It's still a G grace note and a D grace note. And if anything, the D grace note can be maybe a little easier to get in there at the right size because your middle finger's now down. Let's go ahead and play through this one. Just to emphasize, this exercise is really about making sure your G grace note changes are crisp, precise, and exactly where we want them to be. That's the thing that can make a doubling sound really messy. Along with that, we also again want to make sure that when we play the full speed doubling that we're not overlapping the notes. We don't want this as a B doubling. No, it's not a doubling because there's two grace notes. It's a doubling because there are two sounding tones. There's a B that we're landing on and then another B afterwards. We emphasize the first B with the G grace note. We separate into the second one with the D grace note in this case. So the grace notes, super important, but it's not a doubling because there's two grace notes. It's a doubling because there's two sounding notes. D to E doubling. Now on this one, we're going to be spending some time practicing that crossing note change. So we want to make sure we're not... And again, we don't want that finger floating as we make that hand change. We want a nice, crisp G grace note, even though we have a lot of other fingers to move as we go from D to E. Let's give this a go. Now F down to E doubling. On this one, we want to make sure that, so we're on our F, as we raise that G grace note, both come down together. I don't want this finger coming down before this one. From the F, one comes up, both come down. Now again, we want it nice and crisp and controlled, but as we do that, we want to make sure that they're coming down together and we're not getting that because that's a sound that it can make your grace note not have that nice chop, but more of a and we don't want that. F to E doubling. Now for these E doublings, you want to actually practice just maybe doing some scales or simple exercises with that middle finger. It can take a little bit more stretching, warm-up time to get that grace note as crispy as the G or the D. Those ones are easy. They're pointer fingers. This is your middle finger. So it's a little bit trickier to get the proper size and speed on those F grace notes. So you might want to solo those up and work on them separately too. All right, on to page 2. Now we have the D to F doubling. Now this is a nice tricky one. In fact, if you do it completely correctly, there's actually this moment where kind of everything's off the channel. Notice I'm holding with my... Because if you're on D and you lift everything you need for an F with a G grace note, you're left with just your thumbs. So this one, it's a bit of a balancing act as you do it. It's definitely possible. This is a great exercise to figure out how to get that D, G grace note to F without it being too out of control, or that where you're really kind of grabbing quickly with your hands, which can cause the instrument to kind of, well, shake and be a little out of control. All right, everybody, and then to finish up just this simple little exercise we have here, we have the E down to the D doubling. D doublings don't show up in the beginner repertoire too terribly often. Green Hills has one, Balmoral has a couple, but for the most part, they're not as common. But when you get into intermediate and higher level pipe music, you're gonna find D doublings all over the place. So, super useful one to work on. And the thing on this, again, we have that grace note change down from the E, G grace note down to the D. Make sure, again, you're not making like a big hungry hippos kind of motion as you go from this note to that note. It's still got to be a nice crisp motion as we go from E down to that D. There you go. A couple exercises to help with some of the either more common or trickier doublings that you might be running into in your Highland bagpipe music. But as you can see, if you have a doubling coming from another note that you'd like to practice, it's pretty easy to see how you can go about maybe using this same form where you start on the note itself that you're starting on, playing a couple G grace notes, making sure that you dial that grace note to the right length. Good music stand. And then making that G grace note change crisply, cleanly, and appropriately sized to the target note, and then working in the additional grace noting that you need to make it a doubling, and remembering that the two grace notes need to have enough separation that you actually can hear that note in the middle. That's what makes it a doubling. All right, guys, I hope you found this useful. If you did, please consider subscribing to the channel, liking the video, commenting below with any thoughts you might have or methods you use to make sure that your doublings stay nice, clean, crispy, and all of that stuff. So again, guys, I'm Matt Willis, and until next time, cheers.